We are going to continue with panels 4 and 5, but before we move on to our next panel, I just wanted to make one brief announcement. Today's symposium is not a one-off. It's the first in a series of future symposia that are all part of our new Jewish Public History Forum, which basically will be at least 2, perhaps 3 times a year, offering day-long events, bringing top-flight scholars to discuss issues of historical and political significance. On October 15th, if you want to jot this down on your calendars, we are going to be talking about another pressing issue, and that is the prospect of historical and present-day fascism. The symposium is entitled Fighting Fascism, Jewish Responses from the 1930s to the Present. It's co-sponsored by the American Jewish Historical Society, sponsored by Leonard Milberg. It's going to be a great event, so as they say in CB land, keep your ears on, and you will hear more about that going forward. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Professor Jess Olson and session number 4.
Welcome. Can everybody hear me here? The mic is working? All right. Hello, thank you. My name is Jess Olson. I'm very pleased to be here. I feel very lucky to be with my very talented and insightful colleagues today. We're going to be talking today about religion and culture. We're kind of moving things out of, in a sense, the historical realm, in a sense, into more of the, I don't know, present day a little bit. And so I want to introduce our 3 panelists to begin, and we will be going in this order. To begin with, we have Professor Zev Elef, President of Gratz College and Professor of American Jewish History. He's the author of 12 books and more than 60 articles. Impressive. His most recent book appeared earlier this year, Dyed in Crimson, Football, Faith, and Remaking Harvard's America. And I do need to add this sentence that Zev just sent me just a moment ago. Zev is very proud of the grade he earned and the materials he learned as an undergraduate in Dr. Olson's 20th Century Jewish Thought course at Yeshiva University. I have to take that. I really appreciate it. So thanks, Zev. We've known each other a while. Okay. Our second panelist is Professor Shaul Kellner. Professor Kellner is Associate Professor of Sociology and Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt University and past chair of Vanderbilt's Jewish Studies Department. He's been a fellow of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem's Institute for Advanced Studies and the University of Michigan's Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies, a visiting scholar at Tel Aviv University, and a board member of the Association for Jewish Studies. He served for a decade as the chair of the Wexner Graduate Fellowship, Davidson Scholar Selection Committee. Publications from his National Endowment for the Humanities supported study of the movement to free Soviet Jews have appeared in American Jewish History, Jewish Social Studies, and edited volumes in English and French. His 2010 ethnography of Birthright Israel, Tours That Bind, received the AJS's Jordan Schnitzler Book Award. At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, Vanderbilt recognized Professor Kellner with an innovative teaching award for creating engaging in-person learning environments. And hopefully he'll be teaching a course on that because I'm still teaching online. Our final panelist is Professor Amy Weiss. Professor Weiss holds the Morris Greenberg Chair of Judaic Studies and is an assistant professor of Judaic Studies and History at the University of Hartford. During the 2022-2023 academic year, she is also a faculty fellow in ethnic studies for University of Hartman Center for Humanities and a Center for Jewish History Fordham University Research Fellow. She previously held the Thomas and Alyssa Ellent Katz Fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania's Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. Her research and publications focus on the intersections of American Jewish history, Israeli culture, and Jewish-Protestant relations. She's currently writing a book manuscript. Hello? Was that me? Okay. She's currently writing a book manuscript on the involving relationships American Jewish community organizations have forged with evangelicals on issues relating to Israel. Most recently, her articles have appeared in the journals American Jewish History, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and Israel Studies. Her work has also appeared in the edited volume Armed Jews in the Americas, Teaching the Arab-Israeli Conflict in the College Classroom, and Minhagim, Custom and Practice in Jewish Life. Professor Weiss received her PhD from the Departments of Hebrew and Judaic Studies and History at New York University. So I want to start for our panel by just reading very quickly the description that I came up with just as a way of kind of organizing or framing the direction of today's discussion. From the beginning, Zionism and Israel have been intertwined with American religious identity. This panel explores recent and contemporary snapshots of Israel as a repository of spiritual meaning, a central dynamic of the American gaze. We will explore the intersections of American Judaism in multiple manifestations, including the question of Aliyah, the role of consumption and consumer culture in the image of Israel in the American Jewish imagination, and the wider context of a subject that, interestingly, I sort of noted has not come up yet, in spite of its very outsized importance today, of the American evangelical embrace of Israel over recent decades. And if I were just to add kind of a theoretical structure here, what we're really interested in, I think, is unpacking the meaning of expressions of a material culture as it relates to current perceptions of the state of Israel. And in so doing, I think we're going to reveal three facets of the larger discourse to the question of Zionism and American Jewry that relate directly to today's subject. First of all, the question of religion, both as a concept, but as a tool of action in life decisions. On the consumerism and the connection of consumerism with politics and belief. And finally, what I suppose is maybe a bit of an inflammatory term, but some of the co-option of the idea of Zionism in the service of other, that is, external to Jewish interests or Israeli interests, specifically in American evangelical Christianity. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Elif.
Wow. Is this on? No? It's on. Okay. It strikes me from listening to the bios that this is the first panel in which every panelist has published an article in the Journal of American Jewish History, which is published by the American Jewish Historical Society, which is a very important spoke of the hub that is the Center for Jewish History, which is to say that along with the National Library of Israel, this is one of the great centers of Jewish research and incubator of thought, and it's just, I'll add my name to the chorus. It's just so wonderful to be back here and for the Center for Jewish History, Gav, and for everybody else who leads it to be doing such a wonderful. And it's a great journal. Go to. I wanted to share, it occurred to me just a few minutes ago to do this exercise. This is a Google Ngram, which studies the frequency in which words or phrases appear in the entire corpus, that's billions at this point, of books known to Google. And I thought to ask the phrase, make Aliyah. I could have done making Aliyah, but if you see it, it's incredible. The phrase basically is invisible until 1967. And then all of a sudden, I don't know what to do. I'm a historian, not a sociologist, so I don't do anything after 2000. Why it dips. But just extraordinary, and so much of our conversation will be speaking about hubs and spokes, about the role of Israel in America, and the phrase to go on or to make Aliyah. I just thought to share that for a moment. What I really want to do is share an archival document that I found probably a dozen years ago, upstairs over there. Four Orthodox couples tell their stories about living in Israel, published in 1970, a little tiny pamphlet, colored, this one in coffee stains, not mine. And I want to introduce you to Gitti, Cheryl, and David. So here's Gitti. And let's read, it's pretty visible. I want to read a couple of snapshots, a couple of sound bites from their impressions in very much a post-67 world, and the concept of making Aliyah and the creation of an Anglophone community in Israel, a certain Anglophone culture in Israel. Here's Gitti. I think that more than anything else, I miss shopping. From Auerbach's and Macy's to, what is that? Mashbir. That's not in America. Is a long road downhill, but not to with casting no aspersions. I'm just reading it very late. I'd miss a sale on something that is wrong. I miss the superabundance of goods in America, but Israel offers spiritual goods unavailable anywhere else. I don't mean to sound trite and hackneyed, but I'm a lot less materialistic here than I was in the States, and that's healthy. Next. Here's Cheryl. Very interesting. New York is not the place for a Jew to live. Touché. Although I wasn't very aware of Israel as a kid, the Six-Day War, remember it's only 3 years prior to this publication, the Six-Day War made me want to go there very much. Now, Israel as my home is as natural as breathing. And finally, David, or I think he went by David, last text. Unlike the other two, he made Aliyah just a few years prior with his family. My family came on Aliyah in October of 1972. We had the usual and sometimes unusual problem in adjusting to our country. But from the first day we were here, we considered it ours. There are many things I find distasteful in Israel. Most of them, again, I'm reading very, very late. That's what historians do. We read the news very, very late. There are many things I find distasteful in Israel, most of them manifestations of the fact that Israel is a secular Jewish state. Yet despite the secularism, I find Israel to be a very Jewish country. In the United States, my religious life had little to do with my political beliefs. I lived a schizoid life, full-fledged, and remember, it's an Orthodox Union publication, full-fledged Orthodox Jew, and at the same time, full-fledged American. I do not mean to imply that the two are incompatible. For me, they were simply two distinct parts of my being. These, and this is an artifact I wanted to call to your attention, these betoken a broader movement that make Aliyah, that what some folks have called the brain drain of American life. And this is not just about the Orthodox. Certainly there were great leaders in the conservative movement, to some extent the Reform movement, Zionist thinkers. But what happens in post-1967 is that there are young people who inspired for a variety, and to understand the revolutions of the post-60s and social and cultural atmospheres are also a part of it. But the post-1967 world of folks going on, that's the phrase they use, making or going on Aliyah has a transformative effect about the relationship between the United States and Israel. Whereas only 20 years prior to that, Milton Steinberg, not giving a lecture not too far away from here, would discuss in Dubnowian terms that America was about to become the great center of global Jewish life. He could never have anticipated, he died too young, of course, could never anticipate that it actually be a shared Dubnowian center between Israel and America. And in 1967, from Zionist thought to Jewish scholarship in universities to religious thinkers, the movement from America to Israel post-1967 creates a discourse that, again, Steinberg or anybody else could never have anticipated. And what that does is also creates both in English, and I want to point that out, is that very often there's a disconnect between American and Israeli. It's a language barrier, and certainly I don't want to suggest that Americans did not go on Aliyah before 1967. But what happens most profoundly is that you have Anglos living in Israel who settle in so-called Anglo communities, and they retain their English language, both in speech and also in writing. And what you see over time, and I know what's going to come in some of the images we're going to study and talk about together, and I'll close with this, is that you have it. I want to sort of widen it, because I'm not the first one to point out a post-67 dueling center, America and Israel, but particularly in English language, around materialism, around intellectualism, around spirituality. All of those texts from that very curious OU document, Orthodox Union document, they betoken something larger. It's a conversation transatlantic, but particularly in English.
Thank you. I think we'll go directly on to Shaul before we introduce more discussion points.
Very good. Thank you, and we're gonna stick with the theme of shopping. So if we can, and I want to bring this. This is a familiar image. Okay, I want to bring this down further to the folk level. Professor Moore brought us part of the way there when we're talking about Exodus, but we're still in that moment talking about well-known names, Hollywood producers. Here, I won't be bringing many names of actual people. We'll just be looking at artifacts that people, a lot of tourists have embraced when they were traveling to Israel. So Zionism, of course, was never solely a political project. It was also very much a cultural project and a linguistic project, as we have heard with the revival of Hebrew as a vernacular, but also very much an economic project. And one of the ironies in what I'll be talking about is, given how much of Zionism was forged in socialism, and it's all with Marx and production, we're going to be looking at an American Jewish connection to Israel that is very much about consumption and consumerism. So I'm not, there are many who have written about this. Jeffrey Chandler and Beth Wenger have written about consumption as a mode of Jewish connection to pre-state, to the Yishuv, Israel in the pre-state era. Emily Alice Katz and Joellen Zolman have written about consumerist connections to the early state of Israel in the 1950s. We're going to push it a little bit forward. We're going to look from the 1970s to the present, and we're going to look beyond connections to Israel through Israeli-made goods to connections to Israel in part via American-made goods. And so we might be able to talk about this as a form of consumerist Zionism, a particularly American Jewish form of connection. This is not Zionism as political critique. This is I think at the folk level, to understand American Jewish connections, many American Jews are not engaged in the politics or the deep thinking of these political questions, but their engagement with Israel happens on a much more quotidian level, and I think that when we look at consumerism, it gets to that. So we'll do that through a tale of three beverages, the first being Coca-Cola, which even if you don't read Hebrew, you probably can recognize the iconography that this is in fact Coca-Cola. So this is popular, has been popular since the 1970s as a tourist t-shirt that foreign visitors who are going to Israel will buy at a place like Mr. T or some other famous tourist t-shirt shop. Notice that the logo here is not being used to mark a bottle of cola. And that's the significant thing about it. Once that Coca-Cola logo in Hebrew gets emblazoned on a t-shirt, the symbolic meaning transfers to something else. It's about the logo itself. It's about the familiarity of the Coca-Cola icon, but with a twist. And the twist here is that it is not written in the original and familiar English script. So what's the appeal of this to American Jewish tourists who are buying this for themselves, buying it to give as gifts? Part of it, I think, is the curiosity or the novelty of seeing icons of American culture that have no Jewish associations expressed as Jewish. And here you could say the Hebrew signifies Israeli, but I would say Hebrew for American Jews looking at this lettering. And in general, when American Jews are learning to read or decode the Hebrew language, it's happening in a synagogue school in a religious context. This is clearly not a religious context. So here, the Hebrew lettering is signifying Jewishness as well, not just Israeliness. But it's more than that. I think also what's happening is that we're seeing an American mass market consumer good that is adapting to a Jewish model. And this is not just about marketing to Jews. Jews are very much a market in the United States. Jewish tourists do not come to New York and buy an OU, Orthodox Union, t-shirt as a sign of their having visited a great Jewish center. But Jews are a market here, and many of the products that American Jews buy, if they look, they can find a marketing that's Jewish, but does not hold the symbolic weight that, I'm pointing to my version of the image, that image holds for them. That signifies to American Jews a power that they don't have. They can't get Coca-Cola to change its word mark, its iconic logo. Israel can. And so in looking to Israel, they're not just seeing Israel, they're also in a way seeing themselves. Part of this is also a sense of dignity and recognition and affirmation. Their culture is being recognized by Coca-Cola. And when we think about the politics of recognition of Israel, and we've talked already about the United Nations, but corporations have the power to confer legitimacy and to withhold that legitimacy. And so in looking at Coca-Cola, American Jews are reading that as a sign of acceptance of Israel, but also acceptance of Jews as a collective, as recognized by a powerful American corporation, legitimizing agent. Okay, but it does cut both ways, and if producing the icon, the word mark in Hebrew is one way of recognizing Israel and recognizing Jews, then not producing that word mark in Hebrew is a way of withholding recognition. And if we can go to the next slide. How many of you remember the boycott, the Jewish boycott of Pepsi? Okay, some. This was a prominent form of Jewish political consumer action in the 1970s and 1980s. And what you're looking at here is a poster that was promoting the boycott of Pepsi-Cola. This was produced by an organization called the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, and you will see that it is juxtaposing a bottle of Pepsi-Cola which has lettering in Cyrillic because it was being sold in the Soviet Union, and in Arabic because it was being sold in Arab countries. It was not selling and did not have at that time, they were not selling in Israel, and so there was no Hebrew Pepsi-Cola. One of the ways to understand the popularity of the Coca-Cola t-shirt was that this becomes popular at the same time that there's a boycott of Pepsi. We'll talk about the Cola Wars in a moment, and if you have strong feelings about the Cola Wars, please withhold your applause and your boos. I know it can rile people up. So for those who have heard about the boycott of Pepsi, I would imagine that most of you will have heard of this as American Jews don't drink Pepsi or shouldn't drink Pepsi because Pepsi sells to the Arab countries and boycotts Israel. That is not how the boycott actually began. The boycott began on, we can actually have a specific date, on November the 22nd, 1972, when the Southern California Council for Soviet Jews announced the boycott. 1 week earlier, Pepsi-Cola had signed a deal with whatever the Soviet ministry was that was producing their beverages to produce Pepsi and bottle Pepsi in the Soviet Union. And this did make Pepsi the very first American consumer good produced and marketed in the Soviet Union. And activists in the movement to free Soviet Jews had been, for a year or two before that, trying to figure out ways of starting economic boycotts and using that as a strategy, but they were having a hard time getting American Jews to boycott Mack trucks and boycott IBM, but all of a sudden you had a consumer good that, everyone's going to the supermarket and they have the choice between Coke, Pepsi, RC, whatever it was. And this was a way that they could actually use the consumer boycott to get people involved in the campaign to free Soviet Jews. Very, very quickly, the fact that Pepsi is also not selling in Israel, and Pepsi never said, yes, we're adhering to the Arab boycott. They always said they had reasons why they were choosing not to sell it, wasn't competitive and the like. But this issue becomes fused to the boycott, and there's probably what puts it over the top in terms of displacing the Soviet Jewish issue and putting the Arab boycott of Israel as the main issue for why the boycott is happening is that in 1978, 1979, the Baltimore Jewish community runs its annual Jewish Cultural Festival, and they're serving Pepsi products, and there is a revolt within the Baltimore Jewish community. They buy an 8-page spread in the New York Jewish Week talking about what an abomination this was, that the organization that sponsored this was called Jews Against the Arab Boycott, and then from the 1970s and through the 1980s, the question of whether Jews and Jewish organizations should be buying Coke over Pepsi was an actual political issue that people could make in their choices. And if you noticed what you drank for lunch today, it was not Pepsi. So these things have legs. The cola wars of the 1980s were actually a pretty big thing. There were real live casualties in this. You will remember Michael Jackson when his hair caught on fire filming a Pepsi commercial. Elton John, Whitney Houston had lined up for Coke. American Jews in that era had a way of consuming Jewishly and making a choice in this most American of battles, the cola wars, that was not about which soft drink tasted better, but that they could express themselves as Jews through this. So consumer choices in the US are a way of expressing a connection with Israel from afar, both in terms of what people are choosing to consume and also what they are not choosing to consume. And now I want to bring to the third beverage, and we'll bring it up to the present. We have SodaStream. So this is different from the story of Israeli Judaica as a mode of connection, because SodaStream has no visible markings on it that would tell the consumer that this is an Israeli product. So the knowledge that American Jews have, if and when they're buying SodaStream as a way of expressing a connection with Israel, is by word of mouth knowledge, or they're reading something, or there's an email chain about it as well. And there are a number of products like this ways. The pill cam. So if anyone's going for a capsule endoscopy at some point, the last time I went for a capsule endoscopy, my mom said, "Oh, so you're going to get the Israeli pill?" I said, I don't know what the Israeli pill is. She told me, they invented it in Israel. This is a way that American Jews connect to Israel. So it's a knowledge of the product itself that is not advertised in the product. And that's different from purchasing Judaica that is produced in Israel, which marks its Israeliness, which marks its Jewishness. So I'll conclude. Lest you think that this is just a cute side note to the weightier presentations, we're often inclined to dismiss consumer culture as something that is not serious. But consumerism is the bedrock of life in a free market capitalist economy, right? If we are not shopping, the economy collapses. This is fundamental to how our society operates, and also to how we as Americans, as moderns, as human beings, create and craft our identities. It is through our consumer choices. And American Jews have been using consumer choices as an extremely durable mode of connection with Israel that goes back all the way to the years before the state and up to the most high-tech versions of this in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. I would add that I actually have a Kiddush cup made by the Betzalel school, probably in the 1920s, which I want to say is the first attempt to make, Judaica exportable from Israel. So it goes back very far indeed. Amy, or Professor Weiss, excuse me.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, great. So in thinking of today's conference theme, American Jews and Zionism, I've been grappling with this idea of how do we include a group of Christian Zionists in this conversation? Are they beyond the pale? Are they part of the conversation, right? American Jews and Zionism. And so I thought we'd do a little thought experiment and think what it would be like if we talked about that, and that is what I'm going to do. This idea, and just to be clear, as a scholar of American Jews, and one who studies evangelicals, one who studies Christian Zionists, I think it is really important to understand what evangelicals have to say about Jews. This idea of evangelicals, as we may or may not know, are very interested in Jews and Judaism. And so by knowing, and especially I would say not necessarily at every point in American history or world history might this be significant, but I would argue in this contemporary moment, having American Jews, scholars of American Jews, know what evangelicals are saying is significant. It's only through the Christian historiography that we can have a fuller picture. Right, so this idea of how might U.S.-Israel relations or Jewish-Christian relations be more fully understood if we only learn about the Jewish perspectives of Jewish-Christian relations. Or, right, so this idea of how can we learn both about the Jewish and the Christian perspectives. So here, in looking for a primary source or an artifact, although something on a website, want to say this is an artifact, but there, I'll give some background. So CUFI, Christians United for Israel, the largest Zionist organization in the United States, which, let me say that again, it's a Christian organization and it is the largest Zionist organization in the United States. According to its website, it boasts 10 million members. Right, if we want to take that at face value, we can definitely do that. And if we do, we know that there are definitely less than 10 million Jews in the United States. And of course, all of the Jews in the United States are not Zionists. So here, this idea of you have this very large contingent of evangelicals of different denominations and different understandings about how the second coming will come about, different categories, charismatic, fundamentalist, but yet you have this large number who specifically abide by the mission of CUFI. And if you will, I'll just read, this is from their website. So CUFI started in 2006 by Pastor John Hagee. Hagee formerly was associated with Cornerstone Church in San Antonio, a non-denominational evangelical church with 22,000 plus active members. Right, as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh, they're not even putting members, active members. Thinking about any synagogue that would love to have 22,000 active members. So the mission, according to CUFI, taking it a little bit more in the present from its 2006 founding. When thousands of Hamas rockets prompted the 2014 war in Gaza, we, being Christians United for Israel, brought a pastor from every state to Israel during Operation Protective Edge. When the foreign policy establishment opposed moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, CUFI activists sent the administration over 135,000 emails. When Israel was under attack by terrorism, subsidized with American tax dollars, and again, this is coming from CUFI, CUFI rallied over 1 million emails to Congress to help pass the Taylor Force Act. And when anti-Israel forces in Congress tried to stop a vital resupply of Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, CUFI was there to beat back this insidious effort. So in case it's not clear, according to the mission, according to the website, CUFI is there. CUFI was there. When the US government might not have been, CUFI was, right? So setting up this idea that they have really taken on this role of protecting not only Israel, but also protecting American foreign policy, that they, as this Christian Zionist lobby, have this entree into this society. Now, looking at the document before you, there are several primers on the CUFI website, which I find very interesting, right? Who are the audience for these 1 to 2 to 3 page primers on a variety of topics? Here we have the CUFI primer on Jerusalem, the deep yearning that beats within the Jewish heart. There's also the primer on the biblical foundation of Christian Zionism. But what I will highlight between what we see here, and it has 2 other pages, but I think this one page is proof enough of what the focus will be, we'll see in a second, is this connection between ancient Israel and modern Israel. And that's something that we can, either in the Q&A or in our larger conversation about American Jews and Zionism, think about where is CUFI situating itself? What are the connections, if any, between American Jews and Zionism? So here I'll just highlight that in July 2021, Pastor John Hagee at a CUFI summit in Dallas made this assertion that Israel is not a political issue. Okay. Israel's not a political issue. Israel is a biblical issue. If you believe in the Bible, you will support the Jewish people. And so here, right, this really interesting idea about what does that mean? It's not a political issue, it's a biblical issue. And so throughout these different primers, there's a lot of source text from the Bible. It says this, therefore Christians must support Jews and Israel. And so perhaps one of the main texts is Genesis 12:3, the idea that God says, I will bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you. So this is often taken as one of several biblical texts suggesting that this is why evangelicals, why Christian Zionists support Israel. Now, also this question that comes up, if this is a biblical issue, and you can see on this, this primer, this connection, that this biblical history to Jerusalem, that Jews and Jerusalem have always been connected. And so this, and again, I would argue with Pastor John Hagee, if we're going to make this claim that Jews and Jerusalem, that Jerusalem has been a sovereign part of Jewish identity for millennia, I would argue that that is a political statement. But it's important to note here this idea, by this continued focus on Jerusalem, this continued focus on the Bible, that we're also seeing these connections between biblical prophecy and the end of days, with culminating in Jesus Christ's second coming. So we can talk about that as well. Well, what does this mean in terms of those many Jews who support Zionism but do not believe in the second coming? And so here, but I do want to highlight how this connection with Jerusalem, this connection with the Bible, the conflation between ancient Israel and modern Israel plays out. And I think one way where we can see it playing out is in the 2018 American embassy relocation from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, where you have Pastor, again, John Hagee, giving an invocation. And it's here, it's no wonder, right, that you have evangelical or Christian Zionists are the ones who are promoting this move to Jerusalem. We see it right here, in this idea that Jerusalem has been sovereign, and this is only a natural step, if you want to even call it a return, to how it had been. And so we see, and this is how I'll conclude, thinking about, well, what does this mean in 2018 and ensuing years, where you have evangelicals as well as, in some cases, Orthodox, Chabad rabbis, ultra-Orthodox Jews who are supporting at the time, the Trump administration and the Netanyahu administration. But at the same time, what are we seeing? We are seeing, especially through the 2018 ceremony, you're seeing at the then Trump administration, but also the then Netanyahu administration, that they see these individuals, these two groups, but mainly Christian Zionists, as their counterparts. And it's something to think about in terms of looking at the vast 20th century history of American Zionism, that who were the political partners of the American government. And we saw earlier this question of, depending upon who you asked in the American government, Israel might not have been established. But at the same time, looking at leaders of Jewish organizations, that they were often the go-to or intercessors with the US government. And now it's a question of, where are Jews still involved, and to what level has CUFI and other Christian Zionists taken this opening, right, representing the largest Zionist organization in the US, and how have they perhaps understood the political playing field, and what comes next? And I think I will leave it on that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Weiss. And I have to say, I'm really pleased. It worked out. We didn't plan this, but it worked out really great. That where you ended is exactly where I'd like to pick off. Right? This is Bashert. And I want to use that to actually connect with Professor Dashmore's great observation about the, I don't know if it's too much to call it the effacing of kind of historical reality, such as it is, with romance. Right? By reflecting on the fact that there seems to be something very potent in that structural idea in what we're talking about here, right? And what I mean by that is, and I'm just going to put this out as a proposition with a question mark at the end. I'm wondering, to the extent to which what unifies these three topics is a dynamic of almost a kind of cultural possession. And what cultural possession I'm referring to is the possession of a type of thinking that's an intersection of religious belief, consumer culture, representation in media, right? All of which intersect in religious action, right? And intersect in political action, intersect in popular culture, right? All of these things coming together, which I'm thinking out loud that on three levels. On the level of, actual core people choosing as Americans to change their identity, but not their culture, and emigrating to Israel as, for lack of a better word, I mean no disrespect, but really as Americans in Israel with a different passport, right? And yes, they're Jewish Americans living in Israel in a Jewish state in a Jewish way, but the culture remains quite consistent between Teaneck and Beit Shemesh, right? So I hope I didn't put anybody knows out of joint with that one. Second, on the level of culture and consumption, which obviously the representation of Coca-Cola, and I would just like to point out that at the same time that Jews were using Coca-Cola as a tool to bash, opinions that were contrary to their understanding of what supporting Israel looked like, Coca-Cola was benefiting in the Cola Wars from a political cause, taking it up and helping their bottom line. I think that's an important thing to point out. And I do think we saw a similar interaction in maybe a kind of an opposite way with the SodaStream debacle a few years back, if I recall correctly. The fact of the plant manufacturing a lot of the, I think it was the CO2 cartridge, I'm not sure exactly what, was located in an agreed upon location in the West Bank. And finally, on the level of physical being, right? So I'm asking, do you see this, or is it an overstatement to say we're looking at a kind of making of Israel American, right, for lack of a better, and then in the most extreme version, right here, right, where it is literally becoming, and I do believe in the evangelical view of the world, Israel is an extension of their religious structure, right, regardless of what Jews think about it. So there is a question there somewhere, if you can find it.
What I think is interesting is, well, we're focusing on a particular moment in time and strategies which are, to a certain extent, sui generis to this moment. There is a through line. One could also speak about Unitarian and Reform religious leaders in conversations with one another. The idea of consumerism, where Louis Marshall in the early 1920s, don't buy Ford automobiles. The idea of using your money to take a stand on anti-Semitism. And here's the trickiness between Zionism and Jewish identity and combating anti-Semitism. Actually, I remember being a child, and my family's was the only Ford Taurus in the carpool line, and my mother had to defend, Well, nobody else makes a very good station wagon. Just to indulge me in one quick moment, I remember also growing up in Baltimore, where the very first kosher food stand in any baseball stadium was Camden Yards, the Baltimore Orioles, and it somehow damaged that very propitious moment that the official soft drink of the Orioles to this day is Pepsi. And when the Baltimore Ravens moved to town, it was hailed as a very important moment because to this day, the Baltimore Ravens are a partner with Coca-Cola. And though these things, there's still parts of this from before, in our moment, and after, that there is a through line.
Well, so just relating to this idea of this Americanization and this through line, I will say, coming back to the lead up to the move of the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that there were posters put up throughout Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, with these two images. One of David's capital, so like this, right, Ir David, the city of David, with the halls of Congress. And the statement was from Jerusalem, D.C., to Washington, D.C. And the Jerusalem, D.C. meant David's capital. So again, this connection between from Israel to the U.S., there's a connection. And then from the ancient time all the way to the present, there's a connection. So, right, so this idea that even if the embassy relocation is still taking place in Israel, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that there is this very strong American connection.
And I can hold if there are questions from the audience.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, because I was waiting. But, all right. So I want to bring in another kind of area here. There are a number of questions that I'm going to kind of consolidate regarding a couple of points. Let me see if I can unify them. The question of the attitude towards the settlements, towards the West Bank, right? Towards that reality and the conflict that is obviously very much present. We've seen many iterations of that. There's curiosity as to the connection between evangelicalism or the attitude towards evangelicals and that specific political, and I would call it a political, religious, cultural question. And I'm going to try to be very cute here and tie it into the question of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, right? So maybe I could just say that, and you can run with it.
Okay. Ben & Jerry's, yeah. So I think in preparing this and thinking about how consistently American Jews have used their consumer behavior as a mode of expressing connection to Israel it helped me to think about American Jewish reactions to the boycott, I'll say boycott divestment movement, because it's not really about sanctions in this instance, but about boycotting. And that boycott movement as economic warfare has been a spectacular failure, but as a form of symbolic warfare for American Jews. What gets American Jews so riled up about it? And I would think that there is a dimension of it that it attacks an American Jewish mode of connection. And so in that sense, American Jews may be feeling the boycott movement in a personal way. It's not necessarily about Israel. It's about their mode of connecting with Israel. And so then I think about how and Ben & Jerry's did not boycott Israel. They said they're not producing in the West Bank, but that was met in the American Jewish community with an informal counter-boycott among parts of the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community is divided on the issue, but some then went back to this mode of, we use the consumer choices to express the mode of connection to Israel, and so we're no longer buying the Ben & Jerry's.
Professor Weiss, did you want to weigh in?
So I will say that with this concern about Israel and greater Israel, settlements, for at least the members of Christians United for Israel, they see that, right, 1967 as one of the well-known publications right after the 1967 war came out, that the puzzle pieces are fitting together, that this was a sign of the end times, that now not only do you have Israel, the reunification of Jerusalem, you also have the acquisition of additional territory. So right, Greater Israel, again, the Greater Israel that appropriates the Israel that they understood to be in the Bible. So 1967, in that sense, is a watershed moment for these evangelicals, as are future times in terms of, oh, this might be something that is highlighting the end times. But I will say that you do have CUFI, this large Christian Zionist organization, but you do start to see within American evangelicals this growing movement of evangelicals who are questioning Israel's sovereignty and sovereign rights to all of Jerusalem and all of Israel. And this is something that I'm just starting to really dig into this. What does it mean to have these divisions, not only, of course, within Judaism, but the divisions within evangelicalism that we might be hearing very loudly from Christian Zionists, but what about the evangelicals who are saying, well, what about Palestinian rights? What about what's going on in the West Bank? And I think that, although outside the purview for today, is also something I think really fascinating about how we can understand Jews and Christians and their own, perhaps similar, and in some cases different ideologies about Zionism and Israel.
Did you want to weigh in?
No.
Okay. Ooh, got a lot of. Okay, great. So now I've gotten like 4 questions on the same thing, so I'm just going to go plow ahead with this. This I think is a question, and I'm going to make it relevant to consumer culture as well, even though it is kind of a theological question. There's a lot of interest in the issue of millenarianism, of messianism, and the role in the minds of different evangelical thinkers. And how they view the reality of Israel in vis-a-vis their own theology. I would like to fold into that Professor Elif's, let's call it population of interest based on this pamphlet, right? Which is kind of, it is an Orthodox community. It is the primary community, I would argue, driving American aliyah to Israel now. And there is a core element of that very question from the Jewish perspective. And how I'm going to bring consumer culture into this is that the representations and the imagining of all of this is being played out constantly through imagery in culture, right? And the way in which even the city of Jerusalem is represented, the images of Olim, the images of Christian evangelicals blowing very large shofars, which they like. I am a psychoanalyst. If you want to hear my opinions on that later, I'm happy to fill you in. So I just wanted to open that, I just wanted to open that up. But seriously, the question of messianism and how does that weigh into these cultural questions? Would you?
Yeah. What's interesting is that, for example, when one applies to become a member of the Rabbinical Council of America, the final box one has to do is that they do not believe that Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson is the Messiah. Was not a joke. That is in the inventory, the fields for application. You would anticipate that there would be somehow hesitation about Christian messianism. But I think that this is also a question of competing forces, whereas UJA and other philanthropic efforts in the post-war period were concentrating on how philanthropy can go from America to Israel, especially since the 1990 National Jewish Population Study. It's now a question of how can, not Israeli philanthropy to America, but how can American philanthropy stay here? And there are many who believe I would say in the Orthodox world, certainly, but I wouldn't just say it's the Orthodox community. The general Zionist community about partnering with the evangelical community on philanthropic efforts. And that confuses and complicates the matter. But the issue of having, it costs a lot to do Jewish, frankly, however type of Jewish one identifies, in the United States, and the opportunity for that philanthropy has really been on the Orthodox Jewish radar, but I would say the American Jewish radar for the past 20 or 30 years.
Thank you.
It's millenarianism, so I'm going to pass it over here. It's much more squarely.
And Professor Weiss, there have been actually questions on a more kind of basic level of what is the regnant idea of messianism with regard to evangelicals' view of Israel at the moment? If you could, I'm sorry, put a lot on you, but
Well, it depends. The idea, it depends who you're asking, but there are, and I think over the course of the 20th or into the 21st century, this idea of this ingathering of the exiles, that Jews need to be present for all of the puzzle pieces to really fit together for the end of days, culminating in Jesus Christ's return. So there's that concern, I would say, among Jews, this idea of, well, wait a second, what's the end game here? Why, right? Why are Jews, or why are evangelicals so interested with Israel and Jews? Is it because is it a conversion concern? Is it a second coming concern? And then what happens should the Messiah as Jesus Christ return? Well, we've heard the stories about, well, what's going to happen, right? This rapture, what will happen with Jews? And so that, I mean, right, in studying Jewish-Christian relations, that's one of the big questions as to, well, how can you have relationships with people who maybe at the end of days don't expect you to be there? And in all of the work that I've done with Jewish communal organizations, for the most part, their response to that is, we don't see the second coming, at least not in the immediate future. But in the immediate future, we do have very pressing needs, whether it be relating to Israel, whether it be to domestic politics. So let's continue our conversations and these dialogues. And if we need to divert because the second coming has come, we will take it when it comes.
I live in Nashville, Tennessee. It is known as the Buckle of the Bible Belt. It's the center, and it has been for a long time, of Bible publishing in the United States. And so as you might expect, when synagogues and churches partner, there's a lot of partnership between synagogues and evangelical churches. And I was speaking to one such group, and it was about Israel. And it was I probably made the impolitic statement that I channeled Einat Wilf in what she was saying, that this Zionism is a secular movement. It was about Jews rejecting the notion of waiting for God to deliver a Messiah and bring Jews back. Jews were taking their own destiny into their own hands for their own reasons. And I don't know, it was not ill-received. I don't know that it was actually absorbed. When I think about consumerism, there's a messianic version of consumerism, which is that all conflicts will disappear once we all surrender ourselves to the market, right? Two free market capitalist democracies have never gone to war with each other. You've heard that type of rhetoric. So I can be cynical about it, but on the other hand, if we're looking at a movement that begins as a secular movement, but that increasingly becomes treated in religious ways. The other thing I was going to present, if I was not going to be speaking about Coca-Cola, was the stained glass windows that have representations of Israel in synagogue stained glass windows, so ways that Israel becomes integrated into American Jewish religious culture. But you might look at consumerism as something that's holding the ground for a secular approach to Zionism against a lot of forces that are trying to reframe it in purely religious terms.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a really excellent point, and we're going to sum up right now. But what I guess I would kind of like to put as a parting thought is, interestingly, none of the three subjects that our panelists spoke about are political, right? I mean, of course they all are, and that's my point, right? That it may be tempting, as Professor Kellner mentioned, right, to kind of dismiss this as you know, kind of light, you know, as just sort of consumer culture. But this is the water in which we swim, and to the extent that the consumer culture, you know, superstructure really, you know, masks some really significant and complicated political realities, I think is important for us to all pay attention to. Thank you.